Hello and welcome back. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our headlines. US President Donald Trump has threatened Russia with sanctions if Moscow doesn't agree to a ceasefire within 50 days. Trump has also confirmed that billions of dollars worth of military aid is being sent to Ukraine, including Patriot missile systems. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese have met amid rising global tensions, with Xi vowing stronger bilateral ties. Albanese has welcomed progress on trade, citing the value in Australia's relationship with China. Meanwhile, Russia says that their Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has also met President Xi on the sidelines of a Foreign Ministers meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The talks come ahead of a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Xi. Iran have stated that no new nuclear talks will take place if the US insists that Tehran has to abandon its nuclear enrichments. Months of talks over a potential nuclear deal broke down after the 12-day war where Israel and the US targeted Iranian nuclear facilities. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas says that the aid flow into Gaza is improving slightly, but she warns that the situation in the enclave remains grave. Dozens of further deaths have been reported in Gaza over the past 24 hours, reportedly including 5 people seeking aid, that according to local media. Syrian forces have advanced on Sweida as sectarian clashes continue with government personnel. Meanwhile, Israel says that strikes on the southern areas of Syria are a clear warning to the regime. The Trump administration has announced a fresh 17% tariff on Mexican tomatoes, which accounts for 2/3 of those consumed in the US. Discussions with the US and trading partners continue ahead of Trump's August 1st deadline. And a boat has capsized off of the Indonesian Mentawai Islands, with at least 11 people still missing. 8 people have been rescued as operations continue, with reports suggesting that local government officials were on the boat when it sank. We start this hour as China and Australia have signalled a new phase in their relationship. This as President Xi Jinping hosted Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Beijing. The visit marks the highest level engagement between the two countries in years and comes as China aims to position itself as a stable global trade partner, in contrast to rising tariffs and isolationist policies of US President Donald Trump. Let's have a listen to what both leaders have said.
在双方共同努力下，中澳关系走出低谷，实现转换，给两国人民带来实实在在的。
I note your comments in your opening remarks about seeking common ground while sharing differences. That approach has indeed produced very positive benefits for both Australia and for China. It's important we have these direct discussions on issues that matter to us and to the stability and prosperity of our region. As you and I have agreed previously, dialogue needs to be at the centre of our relationship, and I welcome the opportunity to set out Australia's views and interests and our thinking on how we can maintain peace, security, stability and prosperity in our region.
Well, President Xi made it clear that China is ready to deepen ties and promote the further development of bilateral relations. Albanese, in response, emphasised Australia's desire for progress under their decade-old free trade deal, while noting that national interests would remain central to Canberra's approach. Dialogue needs to be at the centre of our relationship, Albanese stated, highlighting key concerns around peace, security, energy transition and regional prosperity. Xi noted that relations between the two nations had risen from setbacks and turned around, bringing tangible benefits to both sides. Albanese is also expected to meet Chinese Premier Li Qiang today, with trade, investment and strategic tensions on the agenda. Albanese's 6-day trip includes a high-level business delegation with Australian mining giants like Rio Tinto, BHP and Fortescue, meeting Chinese steel and energy leaders. Executives from BlueScope Steel, BYD, Baowu Steel and COFCO joined Tuesday's roundtable talks to discuss industry cooperation. Despite the thaw in ties, long-standing tensions persist, including disputes over military activity, critical minerals and the jailing of Australian writer Yang Hengjun. Well, joining us to discuss the significance of this discussion and also the ramifications amidst global instability, Craig Hodges, an Australian political analyst who's joining us from Adelaide, Australia. Craig, thank you ever so much for being here with us. We've heard some of the responses, some of the comments made between President Xi and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. What's your initial thoughts to this meeting amidst so much global insecurity?
Yeah, it's a very important issue, I think, for Australia, Joshua, given the significance of Australia's trading relationship with China. Visiting Xi Jinping ahead of visiting Donald Trump is going to mean that the Americans are going to be very interested in the proceedings over these 6 days during the China visit. I think it's a very wise move to be going to China, particularly with such a senior business delegation, and framing this trip as being one focused on trade and investment. Of course, that can't ignore the fact that in the background there will be human rights discussions and there will be sensitivities from the China side around the lease of the Darwin port. So very complex discussions need to take place. But today we've seen a great first meeting in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, and all reports from both sides, both from Australian reporters on location and from the Chinese Daily, appears that the meeting and discussions appear at this stage to be cordial.
Yes, absolutely. It does seem to be cordial, but of course there are still differences there. A big issue over recent military drills that impacted Australian and New Zealand airlines. Of course, in the midst of wider regional instability, we look at Taiwan, we look at China's relations with countries like the Philippines. How pivotal of an issue is this as Albanese's visit continues? Do you think that will be a point of discussion and something that Australia is concerned about?
Well, I think the discussion will revolve around Australia's national interest. Of course, there's many elements to what defines a national interest. Security is important. You made mention of the recent Chinese naval visit and circumnavigation of Australia. It really did shake a lot of the security community, particularly when that naval visit shifted to a posture of live fire in the Tasman between New Zealand and Australia. Of course, they were in international waters, they're well within their right. There was some controversy over the notification of that live fire exercise, primarily that not enough notice was given. But these are minor points. There's bigger geostrategic and geopolitical issues that would be discussed. I don't think that will be a sticking point in discussions ongoing there in Beijing between Xi Jinping and Anthony Albanese.
Craig, let's have a look then at one of those points that might be a big topic. Trade, of course, has been thrown into so much uncertainty with President Donald Trump's tariff action. Of course, that August the 1st deadline upcoming. But President Xi has tried to position China as an alternative to US trade. Do you think there really is an opportunity here for the Australian governments and the Australian people ultimately to rely more heavily on China, even though that they do also already?
Well, if you compare the trading relationships between Australia and the US and Australia and China, obviously trade relations with China are predominant. Just on the scale, 1/3 of the export goes to China. So that relationship is important. Also, the future with China is very bright. I mean, if you look at China's demand for iron ore, for coal, but also their export market for green energy technology, whether that be windmills or solar panels, Australia has the potential, with the support of China, to re-engineer its economy and look at seriously topics such as green steel. Now, this is a talking point not only with China, but also with our near neighbours, the ASEAN neighbours to the north of Australia. And at the same time, the tariffs causing friction between Australia and the US, and also they are shifting away from taking a more environmental approach to their industries and re-embracing things like coal. So, look, I think it's pretty clear if Australia sees its future being net zero focused and the industry wants to develop its export market from being raw mineral export orientated to processing green steel, combining green energy production plus the processing of steel, relationship with China is going to go from strength to strength. The trade relationship with the US is one revolved around security, high tech, etc. But there's a lot more uncertainty, particularly when you look at these tariffs that are on and off again. So, yeah, it's very, very difficult to compare the two relationships at this critical time.
Yes, absolutely, Craig. Lots of uncertainty, of course, around trade. But what we do know is Anthony Albanese's trip in China will continue. And of course, we will bring all of those developments. Craig, if you stay with us for now, we are going to move away from this meeting and look at an exclusive phone call that has taken place with the BBC, where US President Donald Trump has said he is disappointed but not done with Russian President Vladimir Putin. When asked if he trusted the Russian leader, Trump responded that he almost trusts no one. Additionally, Trump also shared his frustrations with Putin, saying he thought a deal with Russia was possible on 4 separate occasions, but each time it fell apart. These comments come hours after Trump announced plans to send weapons to Ukraine and threatened severe tariffs on Russia if a ceasefire deal isn't reached within 50 days. In the wide-ranging interview from the Oval Office, Trump also endorsed NATO. This is despite having once called the alliance obsolete. He further added that he now believes NATO is becoming the opposite because members are paying their own bills. He also reaffirmed support for NATO's common defence principle, saying it enables smaller countries to defend themselves against larger ones. Well, Craig, thank you very much for staying with us. I would just briefly like to get your thoughts on these comments. Of course, Australia, part of the coalition of the willing, the group of nations supporting Ukraine. Trump seemingly overnight shifting his stance now in this interview with the BBC, acknowledging that deals have been close, but Russia is not making that move forward. What's your initial thoughts on Trump's transition seemingly back towards a more hardline stance on Russia?
Well, I think he's been better briefed from NATO, and Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence, has really had to change his posture. But once again, Trump refers to trade and trade balances and the power of the dollar. He wants to sell this not as a security alliance being bolstered, but as a net win for the US. And once again, it comes down to sheer economics. He's a mercantilist, really. Look, it's heartening. His framing is always in the best interest of the US. But I think for the Ukrainians, they don't care how they get the weapons, who pays for them, they need them now. And if we're going to have democracy and our NATO allies supported, I don't care how it's sold to the media, long as it gets done in a timely fashion. So, yeah, interesting developments. 50 days for Putin. Will he respond? Is there teeth in this negotiation? It's too early to say. But finally, Trump has woken up to the idea of being played by a statesman, another superpower, and Putin's a mastermind. So, finally, he's turned a corner and understood that Putin has been playing him.
Yes, absolutely, of course. And Craig, just to bring an end to this discussion, of course, the sanctions that Trump's mentioned he might impose on Russia could have ramifications as well for third parties, given the fact that of course, it would be secondary sanctions on countries buying energy from Russia. China is a key importer of Russian energy, also India as well. Where Australia are positioned, how do you think that could impact them and their trade relations with those countries?
You know, global economic relations are not always aligned. We know that there is a grey fleet or a ghost fleet of oil tankers that's moving Russian energy resources around the world. We know who the benefactors are. We know that India has been importing increasing amounts of energy from Russia. I'm sure the US will place more pressure on India. So I see there's more friction likely to be brought to bear on China and India if Russian tariffs are going to have an effect. So it really then comes back to the relationship between Rubio with his counterparts in India and China. Imposing unilaterally tariffs like this on Russia isn't going to work well unless he's going to get the cooperation from other trade partners and allies. So India has a big role to play in seeing whether these tariffs will actually hurt Russia in the long run.
Absolutely. Craig Hodges, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us. We now stay with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and several people were injured and buildings damaged following Ukraine's overnight drone attack on Russia's Lipetsk and Voronezh regions. Russian air defences intercepted 12 drones over Voronezh, but debris caused minor injuries and damage to apartments and commercial facilities. One person was injured in Yelets, Lipetsk, after a drone crashed in an industrial zone. The Russian Defence Ministry reported destroying 55 Ukrainian drones over multiple regions. Ukraine has not commented on the attacks, which targeted Lipetsk, a key area for Russia's aerospace forces. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump announced new weapons for Ukraine and set a 50-day deadline for Russia to agree a peace deal. Trump threatened secondary sanctions on countries buying Russian exports if Moscow does not comply. His pledge includes sending Patriot air defense missiles to Ukraine. Zelensky thanked the US for support, but some in Kyiv remain cautious about Trump's long-term commitment. The threat of sanctions, including 100% tariffs on Russian goods, signals a shift in US policy as lawmakers push for secondary sanctions on Russian trade partners. Trump criticised Putin for continuing attacks while negotiations stalled. The situation remains tense, with Russia showing no sign of abandoning its goals. Well, joining us once again to discuss this, we do welcome back Craig Hodges. Thank you for staying with us, Craig. Of course, we've touched on this briefly, but there has been a shift from Donald Trump. He clearly has stated that he is going to back Ukraine now. Let's look at this from a wider perspective. What does this mean for Western allies of Ukraine and allies of Ukraine in general, given the fears that there have been over this Russian advancement?
Western allies have really rushed to support NATO. We can see the shift in recent months with Canada's defence posture, its acquisitions of military material. Australia too has been unwavering in its support of Ukraine and cooperating with NATO initiatives. It feels like America's coming back at a very late stage to this defence support for the Ukraine. Once again, I think that this is a positive move. Is tariffs alone going to convince Russia to back down? I don't know. I don't think it's going to play out that simply, to be frank.
And what's Australia's view, Craig, on this situation? We know, of course, they are part of the group of nations supporting Ukraine, but where would Australia position themselves in these discussions and in pushing for support and an end to this conflict?
Well, I think the common interests in democratic countries defending democratic nations, free nations. So there's a principled approach. There's also the approach of supporting, supplying weapons, technology, supporting their allies in a time of need. Because Australia itself is a vulnerable nation. We would want our allies to reciprocate when Australia may face similar threats. So, look, we have a long history, over a century history of supporting allies on the European mainland. So Australia's Defence Forces are open to cooperation, always have been, have trained together, and we know even in our neighbourhood with the military exercise that European participants continue to show an interest in our region, and conversely we show an interest in their security region as well. So it's an ongoing relationship.
Absolutely, and that ongoing dialogue will continue, of course, as a push towards a ceasefire, a 50-day deadline set by Donald Trump before these sanctions on Russia will take hold. Craig, once again, thank you ever so much for adding your insights and that information there on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Here on NewsX World, we will, of course, continue to bring you all of those updates. But we move on now, and the US has introduced a 17% tariff on Mexican tomatoes effective this week after the termination of a long-standing trade agreement. The move aims to protect US farmers who have complained about unfair pricing from Mexican imports. The tariff could increase tomato prices by 10% and reduce demand by 5%, according to some experts. Small businesses, including restaurants like Teresa Razzo's in California, fear that these rising costs could lead to closures. Razzo's, whose restaurants rely heavily on tomatoes, said give it 3 months and then we go bankrupt. The US Commerce Department ended the 1996 tomato suspension agreement, claiming it failed to protect US growers from unfairly priced Mexican tomatoes. However, Mexican producers argue that the agreement had been largely followed and that the decision is politically motivated. The tariff is part of President Trump's broader protectionist trade policy, with further tariffs on other Mexican goods possible. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has vowed to minimize the impact, but has not provided specific measures. Well, joining us to discuss the ramifications of not just a tariff on tomatoes, but the wider global ramifications of Trump's trade policies, Professor Georgi Toleria, an international affairs expert who is joining us from Moscow. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Professor Toleria. This, of course, is just a snapshot on a wider image and picture that we're getting from the US over these trade tariffs, looking at imbalances. But the impacts we're detailing there, restaurants saying that this tariff on tomatoes, something which could seem trivial, could have an impact on economies with businesses closing down. How significant is Trump's sort of action and spontaneity when announcing these sanctions and bringing them in on a regular occurrence as we've seen over the past months?
Well, of course, I'm impressed by the Trump's salto mortale, I would say, well, changing his mind. And you have discussed this recently. I would like just to add a couple of words on this, maybe by my personal experience, because I just received a message from my brother-in-law in Voronezh, who witnessed the attack by the drone, and 15 people are wounded, and there is some damage. It's just in the center of the city, and he actually witnessed it. So Trump's promise to supply more arms to Ukraine and his dissatisfaction with Putin, it doesn't very well resonate in Russia. Nobody is surprised, of course, and we know how much the Western world is worth, and we know how stubborn our adversaries are. I was a little bit surprised by my Australian colleague comment. I served in Australia for 3 years, so I know the country a bit. So it's a very lucky country, far away from everything. Why should it involve itself into supporting what they call a free democracy? Ukraine is hardly a free country or a free democracy by all means. But nevertheless, I think that Trump's actions and his He has promised to impose additional tariffs on Russia. Doesn't impress much anybody, regardless whether it happened in 50 days or more than 50, or will take longer. The markets are prepared for that. We've been prepared for sanctions, and we've experienced sanctions for many years now. So that won't change Russian strategy, and that won't change war current much. Unfortunately, due to this decision by Trump and possible supply of arms and in other measures of economic pressure on Russia, the war will prolong longer. More people will die, both in Ukraine and Russia, and this is something not to celebrate. But we hope for support of our allies and our friends, including BRICS countries, one of which is India. And I think that India might be well affected by the tariff measures by Trump. So I think it is useful for all the countries to take into account, first of all, their own national interest and the simple notion of justice, not only in international affairs point of view and international law judicial term, but human justice. So how we can approach issues of international.
Yes, Professor
from
Tolaroya.
this point of view.
Yeah, sorry, we just lost signal with you there very briefly. Also joining us to discuss this topic is Charles Thompson, an Australian journalist joining us from Sydney. Charles, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us. I think there's a key point from this latest tariff that Trump has introduced on tomatoes, of course, getting rid of a treaty that stood since the 1990s. And it is the potential impact on people and on American people, both small business owners but also consumers as well, with price impacts taking hold. Do you think that Trump is thinking about the American people, at least not in the short term when he's making these decisions? Or is this really a wider game and a wider play, the art of the deal, and Trump's not necessarily thinking about the collateral?
Look, I know this is a very divisive subject. I know that other countries would wish that this was not happening, but basically Trump has just pulled the plug on the rest of the world and is trying to bring manufacturing back to America. How successful he'll be, time will tell. But at the moment, the figures coming out of the United States are pretty good, so they seem to be doing okay. The difficulty is dealing with his unpredictableness, and this is just Trump. And also I think we've just got to be a little bit more level-headed, not get emotional. I'm amazed to see that I'm from Australia. We still don't have an ambassador from America yet. What are our politicians and our bureaucrats doing in Australia? Give me a break. So communication is the key here. Saying bad things about the Americans, saying bad things about Trump is not going to help anyone. And at the end of the day, they hold all the cards. They are the biggest economy in the world. They're a huge market, and we have to work with them.
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to thank Professor Tolaroya. Charles, you will be staying with us as we move on now. And reportedly, Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is set to meet US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Tokyo on Friday. This meeting comes ahead of an August the 1st deadline to strike a trade deal with the United States. Bessent is visiting Japan to attend the US National Day at the World Expo 2025 in Osaka and will be leading the American delegation. Reportedly, Japan's chief tariff negotiator, Ryose Akazawa, is also expected to hold talks with Bessent during the trip, though a deal remains elusive despite multiple US visits. This will be the first high-level dialogue between Tokyo and Washington since President Trump announced new tariffs on Japanese imports. These also set to take effect on August the 1st. Well, Charles, thank you ever so much for staying with us. We stick with tariffs, we stick with trade, but we now shift to these US-Japan relations. We know that talks have been ongoing. Japanese delegations speaking with US delegations on multiple occasions now. But those goalposts have moved from Trump. The initial Liberation Day tariff slightly shifted. Of course, tariffs on autos, extremely important for Japanese markets, given that sector is a key part of their economy. This August the 1st deadline Trump has set, but also said there could be some movement in it. What do you think Trump's goal is with this deadline? And do you think it's likely that if a deal isn't agreed between the US and Japan, that those tariffs will come into effect on August the 1st? I believe you're on mute, Charles.
I'm mute. Okay.
Thank you.
Look, once again, see, the difficulty is we have to take a step back here. Who knew that there was like a 700% tariff on American rice into Japan? Japan has its own set of rules and conditions that has been running along quite nicely. Trump's pulled the plug on all of this. And it's a huge disruption. And I'm actually surprised. Normally it takes a lot to rattle the Japanese. But from the reports I can see, even the Prime Minister's lost his cool. They're under a lot of pressure here. But, you know, at the end of the day, they have to negotiate. And it's huge. I mean, to be fair, with the car industry, I mean, the Japanese are not just having difficulties with the Americans. They're having difficulties with the Koreans in competition and also with the regulations in Europe. So, you know, this is just another thing that's piled on top of everything that's happening. But I will say, I am puzzled. They are quite relatively new politicians who seem to be running Japan. But in the past, they would have kept this quiet and just done a deal. And we'll just have to see if they can pull it off before the 1st of August. I think there's a new norm, and the new norm is you can have an agreement with the United States, but it will include tariffs on you and not tariffs on the Americans. And the Vietnamese have set the example here.
Yes, absolutely. And Charles, to bring an end to our discussion on tariffs, I want to look at the market instability. Of course, after the April 2nd Liberation Day, we saw a big jolt, but following announcements coming from the US administration, haven't had as much of an impact. Why do you think that is?
There are so many variables here. It's really hard for me to say. I mean, we just once again pause for a moment. United States is negotiating with every single country on the planet, and that's complicated. They're disrupting everybody, and everybody's trying to get a word in, and everybody's trying to have an agreement with the United States. So even on the American side, the people who are doing the negotiations, it must be tough for them. Who do they talk to first, and how do they go through? So this is going to continue for months to come, and I think the interest will be in the next couple of weeks which countries actually pull off agreements with the United States. I mean, it's amazing that Vietnam did it, and now it'll be interesting to see which other countries are able to do that. And only after some other countries pull off these agreements with the United States will there be better clarity, I think, for the rest of us.
Yes, and Charles, we do have time for one further question on this. I want to look forward now, and we spoke earlier in the programme about China positioning themselves as a potential trade alternative to nations that are facing these extra tariffs. How do you think that this landscape will play out if these US tariffs come into force and businesses are looking at adjusting? Could this feed into the hands of the second largest economy in the world, the Chinese economy, given Trump is seemingly focusing his attention and the future of the United States within America and trying to promote America from within?
Okay, so the difficulty with China, I'm in Australia. If I go into a store and I ask for a product not made in China, it's almost impossible to serve me. So the Chinese are already there with their products, and everybody knows this. This is point one. Point two, the Chinese have shown that they're not reliable. So just like there's a problem with the Americans, there's also a problem with the Chinese. So it's not an easy call. It's not one or the other. You've got to deal with both nations. And the fact is there are many goods today which the Chinese make. They make them very cheaply, and everybody else finds it hard to compete with them. So unless countries are considering putting tariffs themselves, it becomes a very, very hard question to answer. So, I think every single business, every single country strategically is looking carefully at all of these options. And some will jump in, like Vietnam was the first. There may be a few others that'll be coming across the table soon. It'll be fascinating. And also it'll be fascinating to see whether the Indians and the Europeans actually finish a trade deal. Because let's face it, they've been talking about a trade deal for 20 years. Could this Trump pressure actually force the Europeans to sit down and finalize their trade deal with India? And that would have a huge impact across the rest of the world, because other countries would then have to start looking at other agreements, other countries for their trade agreements.
Yes, Charles Thompson, thank you ever so much for staying with us and discussing these trade ramifications. We do move on now, and Paraguay is set to welcome Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te next month. President Santiago Peña confirmed on Monday, marking a significant diplomatic visit for both countries. Paraguay remains one of the few nations that maintains formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which China claims as part of its territory. Lai's visit to Paraguay is expected to include transit stops in the United States, a move likely to provoke Beijing, which strongly opposes any official interaction between Taiwan and the US. Peña, speaking at a bilateral investment conference, expressed enthusiasm about Lai's arrival. While Taiwan has several allies in Latin America, many countries have shifted allegiance to China in recent years. This visit underscores Paraguay's stance in support of Taiwan amidst growing international pressure from China. China has regularly condemned US stopovers by Taiwanese leaders, viewing them as a challenge to its sovereignty claims. Taiwan, however, maintains that it has the right to engage with the global community. Well, joining us once again on the programme is Professor Georgi Tolerai, international affairs expert, joining us, of course, once again from Moscow. Professor Tolerai, this situation around Taiwan and China, of course, is contentious. We've seen European countries in recent days supporting the one China policy. US intervention in Taiwan also a point of contention. But let's first look at this specific meeting between the Latin American country and Taiwan. What's the significance in an evolving world of a show of unity with a state visit of this kind?
Well, I think that the problem might be not the Paraguay visit itself, but the stopover in the US. I've read the reports that Mr. Lai might be meeting some friends in New York. I don't know yet who are they, but this is surely 100% provocation. And it's obviously will lead to a very harsh reaction from China. And you know that as for speaking about from a Russian point of view, now our minister Lavrov is in China. He met Wang Yi, the Chinese minister, yesterday, and I'm sure this issue was also discussed. Of course, we will see this as a sort of provocation and increasing tension across the Taiwan Strait, and trying to pressure China again to provoke it. So this is something that I don't think is really helpful.
Yes, and also joining us to discuss this visit that has been announced and a potential visit to the United States, Ross Feingold, a political analyst joining us from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, can I get your response as well to these reports that Lai Ching-te may visit the United States? Professor Tolerai talking about a potential reaction from China and a potential move towards escalating tensions. What's your opinion?
We've been there before. The president of Taiwan has transited the United States once or twice a year, excluding the COVID pandemic period, for basically the last 30 years. They stop off in big cities on their way to visiting those countries in the Caribbean or Central or South America that still have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. They have meetings with members of Congress. Sometimes they make a closed-door speech. Sometimes they make a public speech at universities or think tanks. China complains, and we move on. It's just something that is part of the United States policy towards Taiwan to allow transits of the Taiwan president, and I don't expect that to change under the Trump administration.
Ross, I want to pick up on that. Of course, you mentioned China complaining about visits of this kind if it does go ahead. But with continued military drills around the self-governed island by China, is there a risk that a move like this, if Lai Ching-te were to meet with President Donald Trump, for example, at the White House, do you think this could be a catalyst for an eventual invasion? Or are the people of Taiwan and the government of Taiwan sort of conscious that might be a step further and that actually the reality is more posturing than a real threat?
I wouldn't expect President Trump to meet with President Lai if President Lai transits the United States. That kind of meeting between the President of the U.S. and the President of Taiwan has not happened in the era after the United States de-recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan. So I don't think President Trump would break with that precedent. And frankly, if the President of the United States was to meet with the President of Taiwan while the latter was transiting the U.S., China might very well initiate a military response, including even an invasion of Taiwan. I think such a meeting is clearly one of China's red lines, and the American government is probably reluctant to cross that. The American government is willing to let the Taiwan president transit the U.S., but meeting with the President of the United States is probably too much to ask.
Ross, stay with us, because we are going to stay on stories from the region. I do want to thank also Professor Toleraya for sticking with us and answering a question on Lai Ching-te's potential visit. But Taiwan has launched its largest ever military exercises on Wednesday, focusing on decentralized command and combat readiness in the face of the potential threat of a Chinese invasion. The 10-day Hanquang drills include new systems such as US-made HIMARS rockets and Taiwan's Sky Sword missiles. The exercises also aim to test Taiwan's resilience against cyber attacks and misinformation, which are seen as likely precursors to a broader assault. Around 22,000 reservists are participating with training in mortars and rifles. In response, China intensified its military presence, detecting 31 Chinese aircraft sorties and 7 naval ships near Taiwan. Additionally, Beijing added 8 Taiwanese companies to its export control list, heightening tensions further. Taiwan's government remains determined to defend the island against China's claims of sovereignty, which continue to be strongly rejected by Taiwan's leadership. Well, Ross, thank you for staying with us. These military drills from Taiwan, we know, have been coming. Of course, this 10-day event, we've spoken with you about this on the programme, but China also stepping up their drills with 31 sorties around Taiwan being recognised. Is this normal? Can you provide some context? When Taiwan run these drills, do China normally respond with drills of their own?
Taiwan, excuse me. Taiwan conducts military drills throughout the year. This one in July happens to be the largest annual exercise. It's in its 41st year, so it's something that Taiwan does every single year. Obviously, with the threat of a Chinese invasion, the Taiwan military has to prepare. They're not going to do nothing. So, of course, they're going to invest in their own defense. And there's been a lot of criticism over the years that Taiwan's not really prepared for an invasion. So we do see Taiwan in recent years increasing its military budget and increasing the intensity or the length of its military exercises, including this annual exercise in July. Now, naturally, there'll be a Chinese response as well. China regularly flies its planes or sails its ships close to Taiwan just to test the response of the Taiwan military. That puts a lot of pressure on the Taiwan military when China does that, because Taiwan has to put its own planes in the air and its own ships at sea to monitor what the Chinese are doing. And for the Chinese to do that during the annual exercise just puts even more strain on the Taiwan side. But of course, the China side is going to want to monitor what the military exercises are here in Taiwan. They're going to try and gather intelligence and basically interfere to the best extent that they can with the carrying out of the exercises. Again, we've seen this all before. Of course, it's all very dangerous because we don't want a conflict to occur, but it's not a surprise that both sides are continuing to do what they've always said they'll be doing. Taiwan for its defense, and on the Chinese side, they say they haven't given up the option of using force to unify with Taiwan.
Yes, and Ross, one final point I want to touch on, these new US HIMARS rockets being used by Taiwan in these drills. There are a couple of points I want to touch on here. The fact that these have been purchased, of course, has an impact, US involvement, but also, does this signal that Taiwan does see the risk as higher now in 2025 than maybe it has been in previous years and decades, given that purchase of cutting-edge US technology?
The interesting thing there is, people seem to have short memories, and they're so focused on the current threat from China, and they often forget that there's been times when we thought an invasion was imminent as well. There was what's called the third Taiwan Strait crisis in 95, 96, when China launched missiles very close to Taiwan. There was periods during the first Democratic Progressive Party president, Chen Shui-bian, during his term between 2000 and 2008, when the rhetoric from China was increasingly strong, and China passed something called the anti-succession law in 2005, which also seemed to indicate the possibility of an invasion was imminent. So again, we've been there before with periods of high tension, but the difference perhaps now from the Taiwan perspective and also from the US perspective is the extraordinary investment that China makes in its military, and that just continues year on year. And of course, the technological capabilities of the Chinese military, whether that's their air, land, or sea forces, continues to improve as well. And nobody should ever deny that or think that China is a paper tiger. Their military capabilities have improved dramatically over the years. And although an amphibious invasion of Taiwan would be a challenging endeavor for many reasons, it's certainly possible that China could achieve that. So Taiwan needs to prepare accordingly. And Taiwan's really main and only security partner is the United States. It's the only country willing to sell weapons to Taiwan. You mentioned the HIMARS. Taiwan's also been showcasing some other weapons that it recently acquired from the United States during these exercises. That is, it's showing them off, including Stinger missiles and Abrams tanks. Obviously, when Taiwan buys military systems from the United States, Taiwan needs to test them. They can't just leave them in their packaging. They got to unwrap them and try them out and give the soldiers an opportunity to train with them.
Yes, Ross, finally, we speak a lot about militaries and diplomacy, but of course you're best positioned to talk about the Taiwanese people and what they would want in the face of this threat. If there were an invasion or military action, what would the Taiwanese people want, and how serious are the Taiwanese people about their independence and their self-governance in the face of these calls from China for unification?
Well, most polls indicate that the Taiwan people prefer the status quo, and the status quo is not declaring Taiwan independence, so not changing the name of the country to the Republic of Taiwan, keeping the current name, which is the Republic of China. But they also don't prefer unification. So they don't prefer independence. They don't prefer unification. They prefer the status quo, which is this somewhat nebulous status where countries don't treat Taiwan as an independent country, but still engage with Taiwan on a fairly regular basis. But it's clear that at the moment they don't want to be part of the People's Republic of China. Now, the big question, and to answer your question, is what are the Taiwanese people willing to do to defend their autonomous status? And that's been something of a mystery over the years, and there's been a lot of research into this and a lot of criticism. It's one of the reasons why the current Taiwan government is spending more money on its military. Recently, the mandatory term for military service for young men was expanded from 4 months to 1 year. But are the people themselves willing to support the military in a fight? That's really an unknown. I mean, if China were to invade, would the people demand for immediate surrender and peace to avoid war within the streets of Taiwan cities? That really is an unknown at the moment. People say they want to fight, but the interesting thing is there are a lot of surveys that are conducted here in Taiwan about the willingness to fight. but those surveys might survey the population broadly. They'll survey older people, they'll survey women. They're basically surveying a lot of people who aren't eligible, who won't be part of the fight, instead of just surveying the young men who would be the soldiers on the front line.
Ross Feingold, as always, thank you for that unique insight and extended discussion on the ongoing Taiwanese tensions. We will, of course, continue to develop. We move on now and take a look at the latest from the world of business. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's latest no-show, growing BRICS tensions and Donald Trump's escalating tariff threats are all expected to cast a long shadow over this week's G20 finance chiefs meeting in Durban. The 8 G20 members now in BRICS. Tensions are rising as Trump pushes a 10% baseline tariff on all imports and targeted levies on steel, autos and pharma. US inflation is expected to rise in June, with the consumer price index forecast to increase by 0.3%. This driven mainly by new tariffs pushing up costs. The core CPI, which excludes food and energy, is also seen rising by 0.3%, putting the yearly increase at 3%. Economists say this could be the start of tariff-induced price hikes, hitting households already struggling with high interest rates. The Fed now faces a tough balance. A persistent inflation could delay any expected rate cuts this year. Asian stocks went up and the dollar stayed strong on Tuesday as investors focused on trade talks, upcoming US inflation data and big bank earnings. Oil prices fell a bit after President Trump gave Russia a 50-day deadline to end the war in Ukraine or face new energy sanctions. In Japan, bond yields hit their highest since 2008, ahead of elections that could change the government's spending plans. Japan is also trying to set up talks with the US before new tariffs kick in. US startup funding has surged this year, jumping over 75% in the first half of 2025 to reach about $163 billion, its best performance since the record-setting boom in 2021. This big jump is mostly thanks to huge investments in artificial intelligence, with big tech companies and investors pouring money into AI companies following the popularity of ChatGPT. However, while startups are pulling in big money, venture capital firms themselves are having a tough time raising new funds. Many in the industry believe the rest of 2025 could turn into a pivotal turning point, laying the groundwork for a new phase of innovation and growth. Bitcoin has surged past $120,000 for the first time, hitting a new all-time high as investors cheer on expected policy breakthroughs for the crypto industry during what US Republicans are calling Crypto Week. The world's biggest cryptocurrency jumped more than 3% to reach a record $123,153.22 before pulling back slightly, still up over 27% for the year. This week, the US House of Representatives is poised to debate and likely approve several bills aimed at setting clear rules for digital assets, a regulatory roadmap the industry has been waiting for. Well, that's all we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more news updates from across the world.